Okay, so have you ever read anything by Timothy Keller?
I have, yeah. I've dipped into some of his stuff. I know he's got a pretty big following. What is it you've been looking at?
Yeah, and people seem to find him very compelling. Like he's really smart, but he also just makes you think.
Right.
So I've been reading The Reason for God,
Okay.
and it's really interesting. I mean, this topic obviously has been debated forever, but
Right.
he really does bring in a lot of different angles, like clues. He
Right.
calls them clues, like little hints or pieces of
But
evidence.
interesting. And he's like a pastor. Like,
Yeah.
so it's not just straight up theology. It's more like, how does this connect with what we experience in the world?
Yeah, and that's what I like. He's like, look, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but like, check out this and this and this. Like, it's enough to make you go, okay, maybe there's something to this whole God idea after all.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be cool to kind of dive into some of those clues he talks about, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with something most people have at least heard of, right?
Okay.
The Big Bang.
Right.
It's such a mind-blowing concept. I mean, like all this,
It's hard
everything
to wrap your head around, right?
starting from a point smaller than an atom,
Yeah.
smaller than the period at the end of a sentence. It's
Yeah.
just crazy to think about.
Yeah, and the implications of that, right? Because
Right.
if everything came from that single point, what was there before? What caused that to, like, explode outward?
Right. And Keller talks about how Francis Collins, who, he led the Human Genome Project,
Yeah, a big name in science.
big name, super smart guy, he said this about the Big Bang. We have this very solid conclusion that the universe had an origin, the Big Bang. That implies that before that, there was nothing. I can't imagine how nature could have created itself.
It's a pretty profound statement from someone who's, dedicated his life to studying the natural world.
And that's what Keller's getting at with this first clue, this idea that the universe isn't self-explanatory. Like it had to come from something outside of itself.
Right, it points to something beyond just the physical stuff we can see and measure.
Exactly. And that something else is where things start to get really interesting, you know?
Totally. So it's like this contingent universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning it depends on something else for its existence. Kind of like, well, imagine a row of dominoes, right?
Right. Yeah.
One domino can't fall without the one before it knocking it over, right?
Well,
So there has to be that first domino, that initial cause, to set the whole thing in motion.
and that makes sense, but like, couldn't the Big Bang just be random, like just a cosmic accident, no bigger meaning or anything?
Oh, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
definitely a counter-argument. I mean, not everyone's convinced that this points to, God or some kind of divine creator.
Okay, some people would say it's just stuff happens. End of story.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's a valid perspective.
Yeah.
Sam Harris, for example, he's a pretty well-known atheist. He argues that even if there was a first cause, it doesn't automatically mean it's the God of the Bible or any specific religion.
Right, right. Just because you find a note doesn't mean you know who wrote it.
Exactly. It's a good analogy. And that's why Keller lays out a whole bunch of clues, not just this one, because he knows no single argument is going to convince everyone,
Yeah.
right?
So this is like the first breadcrumb on the trail.
Yeah, I like that, the first breadcrumb. And where it leads, well, that's what we're going to find out.
It's like, okay, we have this Big Bang and it requires a first domino, but then, like you were saying, it still could be random chance.
All right, and that's where the next clue comes in. And it really digs into this question of, like, just how probable is it that everything we see around us is just a fluke,
Okay, so what's this clue? Lay it on me.
So Keller calls this one the cosmic welcome mat. It's all about the fine-tuning of the universe.
Fine-tuning. I think I've heard of that, but remind me.
So basically, it's the idea that the universe isn't just kind of thrown together haphazardly, but that the fundamental constants of physics, like the strength of gravity, the speed of light, even the masses of subatomic particles, they're all incredibly precise, like scarily precise.
Okay, and the implication being?
Well, if any of these values were even slightly different, even a tiny, tiny bit off life as we know it, stars, planets, even atoms themselves, they wouldn't exist.
Wow. Okay, so it's like the universe is like set up perfectly for us to be here.
That's the gist of it. Francis Collins, the scientist we mentioned before, he describes it like this, and this is a direct quote. When you look from the perspective of a scientist at the universe, it looks as if it knew we were coming.
That sends chills down my spine a little bit, not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. And this fine-tuning thing, it's not just some fringe idea, a lot of physicists and cosmologists, they take it pretty seriously.
Really? Even like the big names.
Yeah, even Stephen Hawking, who not, a religious guy by any stretch.
Mm.
He even admitted that the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are, well, enormous, he called them.
And I remember him saying something about it having religious implications. I mean, if Stephen Hawking's saying that, you got to at least stop and think about it, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just him either. There was this philosopher, Alvin Plantinga.
Okay, yeah.
He came up with this analogy to try and explain just how improbable it is that this fine-tuning happened by pure chance. He says, imagine someone dealing themselves 20 straight hands of poker, and every single hand is 4 aces.
Okay, yeah, at that point, you'd be like, all right, someone's messing with the deck.
Exactly. You can't prove they're cheating, but it's so ridiculously unlikely that it makes you question the whole thing, right? And
Mm.
Plantinga says it's kind of like that with the universe. The odds are just that stacked against it happening randomly.
Yeah, I get that. It's like if you saw 50 expert snipers all miss a giant target at point blank range, I mean, technically possible, but
Yeah.
you wouldn't just assume it was bad luck, you know? You'd think something else was going on.
Exactly. And that's what this whole fine-tuning thing does. It makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's more to the story than just blind chance.
Right, like some kind of intention behind it all.
Exactly.
Okay, but let's say I'm still not convinced. I mean, I look around, and the world seems to run on pretty consistent rules, right? Gravity does its thing, the sun comes up every morning. Why rock the boat?
It's a fair point. And it leads us to another fascinating clue Keller talks about, which is the very regularity of nature itself.
Okay, so that's pretty mind-blowing. Like, this fine-tuning thing makes you wonder if someone rigged the game in our favor. But then what about evolution? Doesn't that sort of throw a wrench in the whole intentionally designed idea?
Right, and that's a big one. The evolutionary perspective, it's definitely a challenge to any kind of, I guess you could say, divine designer argument. Like, if you take evolution seriously, how does God fit in?
Right, because evolution is all about random mutations and natural selection, right? Survival of the fittest. So where's the grand plan in that?
Right. And a lot of people, they see those two things as fundamentally incompatible. Like, you can't have both. Either the universe was created by a purposeful God,
Yeah.
or it came about through this blind, unguided process of evolution.
So how do you even begin to reconcile those two viewpoints?
Well, it's tricky, and there are a lot of different opinions on this. Some people try to find ways to harmonize evolution and religious beliefs, like saying that maybe God used evolution as his tool, to bring about life as we know it.
Right, like it was all part of God's plan all along.
Exactly. But then you have others, like the philosopher Daniel Dennett. He argues that our tendency to believe in God, it's not proof of anything divine, it's just a product of evolution itself.
Wait, what do you mean? Like our brains evolved to believe in God. Why would that be an evolutionary advantage?
Well, think about it. Back in the day, our ancestors, they were living in a world they didn't understand, full of dangers they couldn't explain. It might have been comforting to believe that something or someone was looking out for them.
Yeah, I can see that. Feeling like there's some kind of higher power in control, even if it's just in your head, might make it easier to cope with a pretty scary world.
Exactly. And not just that. Believing in a God who rewards good behavior and punishes bad behavior could have helped people cooperate within their tribes, strengthen social bonds, that kind of thing, which, from an evolutionary standpoint, would have made them more likely to survive and pass on their genes.
So it's like this built-in survival mechanism, but not necessarily proof of an actual God.
Right. And that's what Dennett argues in his book, Breaking the Spell. He says that these religious impulses, they were helpful for our ancestors, but that doesn't mean they reflect some kind of ultimate truth about the universe.
It's like those fish that evolved to live in caves, they lost their eyesight, right? Because they didn't need it anymore in the darkness. So are we like those fish, but instead of losing our eyesight, we evolved to have this, like, God sense that's no longer really necessary?
It's an interesting analogy, right? It kind of makes you question, like, what other beliefs do we hold that might be left over from our evolutionary past, but don't actually line up with reality? And Dennett would say that belief in God is one of those things.
So where does that leave us? I mean, if we can't even trust our own brains to tell us what's real and what's not, how do we make sense of any of this?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I don't think there's an easy answer. But I will say this, just because something is a product of evolution doesn't automatically make it false, right? Our capacity for reason, for love, for art, those things evolve too, but we still find them meaningful.
Right. It's not like evolution explains everything. We still have these big questions about meaning and purpose and whether there's something more to life than just surviving and reproducing. And I feel like those questions, they kind of transcend the whole evolution debate, you know?
Absolutely. And maybe that's the point,
Yeah.
that we're wired to grapple with these questions, to search for something beyond ourselves, even if there are no easy answers.
It's like we're hardwired for awe.
Exactly. And that sense of awe, it's something we see throughout human history, across cultures, across different belief systems. So maybe there's something to that, something that points to a reality beyond what we can see and touch and measure.
It's like we're always searching for those clues, like those breadcrumbs you were talking about earlier, trying to follow them to see where they lead.
And who knows, maybe that journey, that search for meaning itself, maybe that's what it's all about.
That's something to think about.